Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Tushar Mehta, and I'm going to be doing this presentation called The Earth is on Fire. And it's about animal agriculture and the global environmental impact. So I'm a family doctor and emergency doctor, what you call A&E over here in the UK. I practice in the Toronto area. I also do some international work. I've worked for many years. I spent 1 month a year working in India. I've been doing some recent work in Haiti. And I'm also very interested in ecological issues as well as plant-based diet and health and the evidence-based medicine, the science behind plant-based diet. Okay. So as we start, I'd like you to take a nice pause, take a deep breath, and take a look at this beautiful image of the Earth that's right there. Okay. And it's a wonderful place, unique in the universe, and from afar it looks so beautiful, and it is. And even from up close, wherever we are, there's so many beautiful things. But there are a lot of problems as well. As we know, in the news these days, we see talk about Brazil and fires in the Amazon rainforest. And what's happening here is not a new story, it's an old story, because every year the forest is being burnt to make way for cattle grazing or for growing soybeans in order to feed cattle and the beef industry. But this particular year, it's been greatly exacerbated, but it's not a new story. In northern Canada, you find forest fires because of climate change, and there's more drought, less rainfall, warmer temperatures. In the African continent, we see a lot of slash and burn farming for many different kinds of crops, including animal agriculture. In Indonesia, you see forests that are being burnt, again, year after year, for the purpose of palm oil. All right? And in the Arctic, this is interesting, around Alaska, Greenland, and northern Russia. In the far north, there are warmer temperatures, less precipitation, drier weather, and there are forest fires in places where there are bogs, and this is kind of a new thing. So we're going to talk about the basic principles around the science behind animal agriculture and sort of the medicine or the health of the planet and the evidence-based medicine for the planet. And this is actually a story of science and numbers. There's a lot of numbers here and the meaning of numbers. I'm going to try to demonstrate what these numbers mean because a lot of times we don't appreciate the scale of what's going on. We're going to talk about agriculture in the context of global ecological parameters, not in isolation with other things. And we're going to start with people. So here's a picture of a place where I've worked in India, and it's a hospital, and it's a hospital ward there. And you can see there's a lot of amazing traditional dress and some great people there. Okay, and this is Haiti. All right, you'll see a familiar face from the audience over here, actually. And what I've learned from the different places I've traveled is that everywhere you go, everywhere you work, you find amazing and beautiful people all around the world. And these people are very, very important. They're not just numbers. Okay. What I also learned at another organization I worked with called Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, where we sailed in the Southern Ocean around the Antarctic, is that the Earth is huge, but the Earth is also very small. If you drive in a car, and you've driven 40,000 kilometers on your car, most of us have cars that have driven more than that, you've gone once around the Earth. That's the equivalent distance. And most of us many times so. And if you look at people flying on airplanes, there's more than 1 million people in the air every single minute of the day. Okay. So there's our Earth. So when we're talking about people, let's talk about population. What does 1% sound like to you? 1% growth. Does that sound like a lot? It doesn't sound too bad, does it? But you take it into context of what's going on because numbers are hard to interpret. If you have more than 7 billion people on the planet, and right now there's about 7.6 billion people, that means you have 1 additional billion people added to the Earth every 10 to 12 years. More on the side of 12 years, but as that number increases, as you go to 8 billion and 9 billion, 1% growth leads to an extra billion people every 10 years. So when we look at the world population, it's going to be roughly 10 billion by 2050. And by the end of this century, it's probably going to be around 15 billion if we're going at our current trajectory. All right? Even with a slight decrease in population growth percentage by year, you're still going to get to 15 billion. If something really radical happens and we make some big changes, we can maybe narrow it down to 12 billion. And if you look at population growth rate, when we start 1,000 years ago, there's less than 500 million people on the planet approximately. And you can see that it's a very, very slow growth, but around the 1800s it grows more, and once you get into the 20th century, there's a rapid growth, and right now there's a radically high growth rate. And this is what's happening to the world. And a lot of people don't understand how what these numbers are or what it looks like. And when we look at poverty and inequality amongst the people of the earth, we see that there's about 800 million people living on less than $1.90 US per day. That's purchasing power parity, okay? And 113 million people who suffer food shortages, 74 million people affected by conflict, and over 40 million slaves. There's definitions of modern slavery. These numbers are huge. When we talk about moderate poverty, there's 4.2 billion people living on less than 7.5 US dollars per day, okay? But on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at billionaires, the number of billionaires is increasing rapidly. But not just billionaires, they're a special case, but the people who are millionaires and multimillionaires, that's increasing ever so rapidly. And 82% of all new wealth generated on Earth goes to the global 1%. And it doesn't take much to be part of the global 1%. In fact, it's about $32,000 per year, US dollars. If you're earning that much per year, you're part of the global 1%. Or if you have assets, $725,000 in assets, you're part of the global 1% in terms of your assets. And those aren't huge numbers for a place like UK, Canada, or America. A lot of people meet that criteria very easily, and the reason is there are such a huge number of poor people in the world. And these conversations about population and inequality and looking at these numbers are conversations that people don't want to have. They make people uncomfortable. Especially when you look at the recent Canadian election or any event like that, people don't want to talk about these things. And they don't want to talk about these things also, or they don't know how to talk about these things with respect and compassion, or rational thinking, or understanding the science behind population growth, social science, economics, and so forth. So what does all this have to do with plant versus animal-based foods? Okay. Now, in 2004, Livestock's Long Shadow, this was a landmark document produced by the United Nations, spoke about the impact of animal agriculture on the environment, the global impact. And in, I think it was 2014, 2015, Cowspiracy, a movie came out, which I hope you all have a chance to see, which talked about animal agriculture and the impact of, and blew this subject wide open to the public. Okay. If you look at statistics about life on Earth, if you go back 10,000 years, early humans, or humans at that time, made up less than 1% of the biomass of all land animals, vertebrate land animals. And wild animals made up 99% or more of the total biomass of all animals on Earth, of all vertebrates on Earth. But if you look at now, if you look at today, wild animals make up less than 1% of the biomass. And about a third of the biomass is made up by humans themselves. And 2/3 of the biomass of the Earth's animals, vertebrate animals, is made up by livestock. Now, these are radical numbers. They're scary numbers. Should make us all pause and think of the impact that humans have had. Now, there's different numbers depending on which group of scientists you look at. Some will say that animals are just 1% of the remaining biomass of vertebrates, and others will say it's maybe around 4%, but it's around the same order of magnitude. Just an example, chickens on Earth, just that one species of chickens that humans breed, outweigh all species of bird, hundreds and hundreds of species of birds, by 3 to 4 times. Okay, so we want to appreciate the scale of our impact. And when you look at the wild vertebrate population, okay, just from 1970 till 2016, 2017, they've been cut to less than half their population in just a very short time. These are all wild vertebrate animals. And the human population has almost doubled during that same amount of time. So the scale that we are changing the Earth, again, 75% of the land-based environment on Earth has been altered by humans. 2/3 of all marine environments have been significantly altered. These alterations can be in greater or lesser forms, but they're significant in all ways. 3/4 of all accessible freshwater systems are devoted to human crop and livestock use. And there's been a 300% crop production increase since 1970. When we look at the world's biomass, okay, the world's plant biomass, humans have cut the plant biomass on Earth to about half over the years that we've been existing in modern times. Okay? And humans control 1/4 of the net primary production. That means everything green that grows on Earth, humans control 1/4 of it right now. And agriculture occupies 40 to 50% of the non-frozen surface of the Earth. And timber harvest is increased by 45% since 1970. We're not slowing down our deforestation. So let's look at how animals are fed, okay? It starts from the basics. Growing food for animals to eat is one way that we feed animals to then feed upon. This is usually grains, soy, oil seeds, okay, and other types of crops and silage that is grown. So you grow that, you farm that, and then you feed that to animals. And the other way that we feed animals is by grazing animals. We cut down a forest or we alter a natural landscape, we create grazing space, and then we graze the animals on that land. And we'll get to fish later. Okay. So feed conversion ratio is a concept that you should all know about. All right. And what that means is that you feed an animal a certain amount of food, and a certain part of that food, a certain amount of that protein and calories is then converted into the animal's flesh. All right. So when it comes to chickens, you have to feed them 4 to 6 kilograms of protein to get 1 kilogram of protein back in terms of their flesh. Okay? For pigs, it's 6 to 8 kilograms, 10 to 18 for cows. And for milk, 3 to 4 kilograms of feed protein turns to 1 kilogram of milk protein. And again, 3 to 4 kilograms for eggs. Now, these are optimized numbers. If you go to places like developing countries or places where they're not fully optimized, the numbers are actually much worse. When it comes to insects, because people always talk about insects, saving the day, but again, the feed conversion ratio for insects when you grow them en masse is going to be about 3 to 4 kilograms, or maybe worse. Okay, farmed fish, again, the same story. Okay, so this is fundamentally inefficient, and that's why there's an environmental impact. Okay, when we look at organic farming or grazing animals instead of feeding them in factory farms, then the calorie and protein conversion ratio is far less efficient. So the more organic or free-ranged you go, it might be somewhat nicer for the animals, but factory farming is actually more ecological because it is far more efficient. And how do we make these animals so efficient to even get these numbers in the first place? Over generations, number one, we've been breeding animals, okay? So you can look at this chicken from 1957, that's what a chicken looked like back then that we grew in a factory farm, and then in 2005 what they look like, okay? And then we use direct gene modification to again make that feed conversion ratio more efficient. So you get these very, very abnormal animals. They're grotesquely abnormal compared to their natural state or whatever, further and further away from a natural state. And the animals do suffer from that. But also we're getting a plateau. We're sort of hitting that plateau that you can only make an animal so much more efficient. Because if you look at more recent years, even the alterations they've done to the genetics get very, very marginal extra yield from that. So we're sort of hitting plateaus. The number of livestock that are slaughtered per year on the planet, 70 billion land animals. And that's hard to conceive of. It's hard to think of what is a billion. How do we envision that? But that amounts to about 2,000 animals per second that are slaughtered on the planet, mostly chickens. And we look at different types of animals. Monogastrics means they have one stomach. They eat grain, soy, oil seeds. That's what chickens have to feed on. Okay, and we look at and pigs as well and other birds. And ruminants, they create methane, but they ruminate on their food. And so that's cattle, buffalo, goats. and they can also graze as well. But they also feed the same things: grain, soy, oilseeds, silage, hay. They eat that kind of stuff. So when we look at these numbers about how the planet has been altered, we talked about 75% altered by humans of the Earth's surface, 40 to 50% used for agriculture, but 30 to 40% of the Earth's non-frozen surface is used for animal agriculture. Okay? So that's our biggest use of the Earth's surface. Now, a quarter of that is very extensively grazed, okay, to the point where we're causing heavy damage to those lands and the soil and everything around it. Now, 10 to 15% of the Earth's non-frozen surface is used for growing crops, but half of those crops are grown to feed animals. And only 5 to 10% of the Earth's surface actually grows crops for direct human consumption. The number varies a little bit depending on the source you're looking at, but it's around there. And the interesting thing is that only 40% of all the protein that humans consume comes from animals. 60% comes from plant-based foods. So you can see the vast inefficiency there. Now, this is just from a United Nations document, but the middle column there looks at land use from different types of industries. And the part that I've circled, that orange column, that is animal agriculture, representing the largest share of human use of the Earth's surface. Underneath that are plants that are grown for human consumption, right? And that's a much smaller amount. And then there's different industries there represented as well. So when we look at the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, okay, it is because of we're destroying the rainforest to grow soy to then feed cattle to then feed humans, or we're grazing animals on the land afterwards. Okay, and that's also the same story in other Latin American countries, many African countries, and a lot of temperate areas in USA, Canada, Europe, Asia. Again, it's always animal agriculture that represents the biggest share of new deforestation, new land use change, or the existing occupied land that's occupied and has replaced natural land. So again, we talked about the less efficiency. Okay, it takes more protein and calories to make a smaller amount of animal-based protein and calories, more land, also more water, more soil, more pesticides, antibiotics, and fertilizers. Land use means ecosystem disruption. Okay, so feeding animals is the biggest cause. We're deforesting the rainforest, temperate forests. Wetlands are drained to create pasture and farms. Loss of grasslands. Grasslands aren't just natural and animals graze on them. Grasslands are significantly altered when there's grazing that occurs. Okay, and it's the biggest single cause of loss of biodiversity. Species extinction and the death of all other types of animals and also plants is because of animal agriculture. It uses the most land. So now also there's things like the forestry industry and so forth, and these things are not when they tell people that these are renewable resources, they're not. When you cut a forest down a few times, it doesn't grow back the same way, and then also you get loss of nutrients and soil loss as well. So even things like forestry have a heavy impact. So factory farming, as I mentioned, is far more efficient, uses less land, but it also creates problems like antibiotic resistance and greater problems in animal welfare. Grazing uses the most land and has even a greater biodiversity impact and causes a greater amount of methane as compared to factory farming. Soil erosion occurs through animal farming as well as plant farming, but first there's the deforestation and wetland loss itself, but there's compaction by hooves. Animals eat grasses to low levels, and they become replaced by sort of less indigenous mix of grasses, and you get more erosion again. Water and wind deplete the exposed soil, and also this also occurs on cropland where we grow plants. Okay, now desertification is the worst form of soil erosion. Okay, and it's heavily, grazing and animal farming is heavily involved in that, and that's when you've really destroyed the land. It's hard to grow almost anything on it anymore. You've completely converted this natural land into like something that's much more desolate. Now, plow-based agriculture, even when we grow food that is plant-based for human consumption, that does impact the soil because we're plowing the land and you lose soil that way. But remember that 50% of all crops are grown to feed animals, or at least 50% of all grains. Okay, and there's alternatives in different ways of farming so that you can minimize that damage too. Sheep, goat, cattle, okay, As I mentioned, they have the impact on the land, native vegetation, and also native birds, reptiles, snakes, and everything that lives on that land is going to be impacted by grazing animals. There's animal waste that occurs. So the defecation of animals also goes into waterways, causing water contamination. And especially when we look at factory farming, there's huge pools of feces that leak into groundwater as well as rivers and land water systems, contaminating them. We get a lot of methane, nitrous oxide from grazing and factory farms as well. Now, the other thing is not to be fooled by the animal agriculture industry. There's this guy here, Alan Savory, and a host of other documents and people that are promoted by the animal agriculture industry saying that, oh, there's all this research showing that if you graze animals on the land, then it helps to recuperate that land. It helps to keep that land natural, and that's totally bogus. It's based on zero proper research, but heavily, marketed on the internet and people speaking about it, and people speaking nice ways about it, but there's no research to back any of it up, and that's a whole lecture on its own. When we talk about water use, 70% of the world's water is used for agriculture, okay? And we mentioned how much grains are fed to animals. 70, 80, even 90% of soy may be actually fed to animals, and only 6% is actually used for direct human consumption. So, we're feeding, all the water we're using for crops, most of it is really for animals. Okay? And there's a big issue there because we're draining all rainwater, aquifers, rivers, lakes. Okay? The water crisis in the world is huge. There's over 50,000 dams on all the major rivers around the world. Okay? Fish cannot migrate properly, and it impacts all those ecosystems. 80% of the world's population is actually water insecure. And major rivers don't even flow to the ocean anymore. They turn to mud or dirt. They don't even reach the ocean. The Indus, Colorado, Yellow River. Okay? And fresh waters have lost more than 50% of their animal populations. And there's threats of mass extinction to animals that depend on these water systems, birds, amphibians, and plants. Nitrogen and phosphorus are in the feces that go into the water, and they cause eutrophication of the fresh water and then eventually the ocean as these rivers go into the ocean. And that causes bacterial overgrowth and different algae overgrowth, and interferes with the oxygen in the water and native species. Bacteria and parasites go into the water, and that makes it contaminated as well. And soil erosion occurs into the water. And as I mentioned, you get these massive lakes of feces from factory farms. And you get these dead rivers, lakes, groundwaters, and ocean coastal areas that are affected by animal agriculture. Coming to climate change, Livestock's Long Shadow in 2006 talks about the combined CO2, nitrous oxide, methane from animals, adding up to about 18% of all climate change gases caused by humans. Now, there's an updated figure by another UN document, 2014. It says it's about 14.5%. Again, there was political pressure behind those numbers. And there's other numbers that go up to 51%. And what you see is different publications will use different factors or sometimes miss certain factors in making these calculations. See these swing in these numbers, but either which way, it's a very large amount. And climate change is, of course, CO2, right? When you cut down a forest, it decomposes and turns into CO2. When you burn a forest, it becomes CO2. But there's also methane released from, and nitrous oxide released from all the dead piles of wood and fecal matter, and also ruminants creating methane themselves from burping. They ruminate and they create methane in their gut. Okay. Now, this climate change is going to, of course, affect future generations more than us. So let's now talk about fish. And we're looking at the blue part of our lovely planet there, mostly. Okay. Now, UN Food and Agriculture Organization stats, in 1950, there's about 20 million tons of fish harvested from the oceans. Okay, in 2016, it's about 140 million tons from the ocean and 60 million tons from aquaculture. In 2003, there was a document that talked about 11 to 26 million tons of illegal, unregulated, and undocumented fish harvested from the ocean. That's the estimate, and it's probably a lot worse now. So what does that mean? How many fish is that? There's an organization that calculates this based on the weight and different species of fish, and it's about 0.79 to 2.3 trillion fish per year are taken from the ocean. And again, what does that mean? What does a trillion look like? But if you break that down, if you let's say if it was hypothetically 1 trillion fish harvested from the ocean per year, that means about 30,000 fish per second that are taken from the ocean. And again, these numbers are staggering. And that's why fishing is the single biggest cause of ocean destruction compared to any other cause. Okay? The other causes, the other problems are exacerbating this problem, but this is the biggest problem. And when you look at the ocean, 33% of the ocean is fished beyond maximal levels. It's completely unsustainable, and they're just depleting those fish populations into nothing. 60% is maximally fished, and there's only 7% apparently fished at levels where the fish can repopulate themselves. But everybody's fighting over the ocean because fishing is a huge industry and fish is very popular to eat for everybody. And farmed fish is not eco-friendly because most of the time you're harvesting species of fish that people don't want to eat, grinding them into pellets and then feeding them to fish that you're farming. So again, you have this feed conversion problem where you have less efficiency. And when you look at eco-certified fish, it's actually the fishing industry that dominates the organizations that certify these products as sustainable. This is totally bogus. It's just like a marketing thing that they do, but there's no real science behind any of these eco-certifications, really. And when they talk about dolphin-safe tuna, there's no such thing. They just put that on the label. There's no method of catching fish that saves dolphins. And there's good evidence that fish have sentience too. Studies about fish cognition, memory, social interactions, pain experience and emotional states, PTSD, all those kind of things. When we look at bycatch from the fishing industry, okay, and unreported, undocumented illegal fishing, shark finning, whale killing, the biggest cause of death of whales in the ocean is actually the fishing industry, where whales get tangled into the apparatus. And there's a military competition over the seas. This is another problem, again, overfishing. When we look at abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear, that's actually a term, okay? It makes up 20% of ocean plastic. We all are hearing about plastic in the ocean, but we don't hear that fishing industry contributes 20%, but it's actually 46% of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, but it's the deadliest of all plastic in the ocean because it entangles and ensnares all wildlife. And in North America, I don't know if you have it over here, but they're trying to ban straws because they're saying, straws, end up in the ocean, they cause problems. It's just a gimmick. They're making these fake solutions to make people feel like they're doing something, but they're not addressing any real issue whatsoever. I mean, it makes no sense that you would ban a straw and not the plastic cup in the first place, but there's no science behind what plastics are causing the biggest forms of damage anyways. And as we mentioned, between 1970 and 2017, 58% depletion of all land vertebrates. So biodiversity, when we're talking about biodiversity, we're basically killing everything on the planet. Birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, fish, everything is dying on the planet very fast. When we look at hunting and the extinction of wild animals, interestingly, in over 50,000 to 3,000 years ago, we call that the Quaternary extinction period. Half of all megafauna species, large animal species on the earth, became extinct. And there was environmental factors, but as well as hunting also being a big part of that. Hunting a lot of these woolly mammoths and all kinds of other animals to extinction. But then there was a period of stability. But currently, again, hunting is one of the biggest causes of large animal extinction. Okay, so there's about 362 species of megafauna on the Earth. 70% are in severe decline, and when we look at, and 59% are really at risk of extinction. And hunting is a big cause of that. Loss of habitat is a huge thing because, again, animal agriculture being one of the main causes. But there's other things too, the roads and cities and everything that we build that crisscrosses the natural environment and stops animal movements and migrations. But hunting as well, when we build roads everywhere, plus you have guns and fossil fuels and GPS, cell phones, the vehicles that we have, we're hunting all these large animals to extinction as well. We're talking about, elephants, we're talking about all kinds of animals. But even in Canada, there's a decline in the moose population, but nobody wants to talk about this as one of the causes. They don't want to look at what's really going on. Of course, there's a combination of causes, but they don't want to look at the hunting factor. Biodiversity loss and extinction. So there's about 11 million calculated species, on Earth, and about 1 million are threatened right now. And even insects are being, obliterated in many cases. There's the extinction of actual ecosystems. And again, animal agriculture, combined with these other factors, is the biggest cause. But we also have to look at overpopulation, other forms of land use, the material economy in itself, other pollutants, climate change, roads, urban design, transportation, and more. Okay, it's not just climate change. You hear in the news all about climate change only, but there's bigger things going on than climate change, and climate change is a result of these bigger problems as well. So food security, how do you feed the future population? Because the population is increasing and we do need to feed everyone. Food security is a big issue. Now, animal agriculture uses 30% of the non-frozen surface of the earth. Now, if you actually converted everything to plant-based agriculture, you could actually right away, pretty much within a few years, feed an additional 4 billion people without using any more land. Now, that doesn't mean that if you grew that food that people would get it, because we're not very good at sharing what we have, right? There's enough money on this planet, but that doesn't mean that every kid gets to go to school in the world, because we're not sharing. All right, so let's look at food justice and competition for global resources. Crops such as soy, we mentioned, mostly feed animals. Close to 50% of the world's grains, crops combined, feed animals. And you're getting a smaller amount of protein and calories back from that, and that goes to the global rich most often. And so we're displacing food from more poor populations towards more rich populations, and there's a food justice issue. Okay. If grains and plant protein that were just fed to animals were fed to humans, again, like I mentioned, we'd be able to feed everybody. Okay. So this means less food for the poor and more natural environment being destroyed. And there's also land grabbing. So richer people and richer countries are grabbing land in poorer countries from poorer people so they can use it to farm things and then send back to their home country. Okay? And this is part of the issue in the Amazon rainforest. They're displacing indigenous people so that large corporations can send the meat basically to China. That's the biggest consumer, business partner for Brazil's beef. Okay? Biofuels are the same problem. Okay? I should also mention biofuels. When we grow biofuels, we're taking away land from people to eat and using it for biofuels for the rich. So this is occurring internationally, okay? Also intranationally within a country, there's food displacement for these reasons. There's this concept of unlimited growth and overconsumption. And plant diet's not going to help unless we also look at the other factors of overconsumption and unlimited consumption and unlimited growth. Global conflict and war also occurs when there's food insecurity, overpopulation, climate change, and a lot of the wars and conflicts around the world. These are part of the tensions and pressures that lead to wars in different African countries, Middle East, and other places too. Food security, food prices, land and water shortages, climate change, and animal agriculture is a big part of that. So solutions, okay, a plant-based diet is one of the fundamental factors in a solution to these problems. But it's still a complex issue. Remember, food waste also means that 30% to 40% of all food is wasted. That's an issue as well. There's big savings. Biofuels, as I mentioned, and other forms of maldistribution. Now, when we talk about replacing animal foods, remember that pulses and whole grains are the main replacement for animal protein. So love your pulses. Okay, there's so many different kinds of beans and lentils that grow around the world. They're part of most diets around the world, actually. And in terms of CO2 equivalents, compared to the most efficient beef, there's like 1/100th of the CO2 emissions, or the CO2 equivalents. 1/10 compared to the most optimal chicken, okay? And when you grow pulses, it helps bring nitrogen into the soil and naturally helps fertilize the soil and helps itself grow. They help themselves grow, but they help surrounding plants grow as well. So it's a way of adding natural fertility to the world. The 2016 was the year of the pulses declared by the United Nations. When we look at indigenous people in the Americas, they grow beans, corn, and squash together, and they find that they grow so well together. It's practiced throughout the Americas traditionally for centuries. And remember also that whole grains contain about 10% protein, so that's also a lot of protein. This is Canada's food guide. I don't know about the UK food guide, but their most recent food guide, the interesting thing was that they excluded industry influence from the creation of this food guide, and they created one that was much more plant-based and heavy on whole grains and pulses and fruits and vegetables. Coming back to the UK, we look at the Lancet journal. So the Lancet has a series on planetary health, and the Lancet EAT Commission talked about how to feed 10 billion people by 2050 and minimize ecological damage in the process. And they're also talking about shifting towards more plant-based foods. And that also reduces the amount of cancer and cardiovascular disease at the same time. So when we talk about nutrition, I'll show you my slide that will lead you to my nutrition talk online. But you want to eat the rainbow. You want to eat a variety of fruits, vegetables, pulses, and whole grains. There's so many of them. And when we eat this diverse diet and we make sure we're getting a balanced diet, you're going to get enough protein and everything that you need, and also reduce a lot of these chronic diseases, certain cancers, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, etc. And you want to make sure that you're eating whole foods. I know that at the Vegfest over here, there's lots of sweets and everything like that available, but I'm going to warn you to eat that once in a while. Once every couple of weeks, you can have a treat. Okay, but eat mostly whole foods. And check this out. If you Google Tushar Mehta vegan red apple, just those search terms, okay, and then you click on videos. So you click on videos, you'll find my talk about nutrition. That's my latest talk about plant-based nutrition. As well, in that talk, there are 2 links that will download all the references for the nutrition talk, but also all the references that I use for this talk. And remember, when anybody gives you a talk about environment or nutrition, you should make sure that you have access to all the references that they use. So that's a very important point. Whole food plant-based diet is better for the environment, okay? So we talked about the different food groups. But remember that some plant foods have a high eco-impact. So the oils that we use, we should be using low fat just for our health, but also ecologically. Palm oil is a particular problem. So the ramen noodles that everybody loves, they're not good for you, but they're not good for the planet either. Avocados, people love avocados these days, but depending on where they come from and the season, they can be very destructive to the environment. Foods transported on an airplane. My dad loves mangoes that come from India, but they're flown on an airplane. They have a bad carbon footprint, okay? Packaging, you gotta look for that. Sugars, so these are all things that we want to watch out for. And human rights as well. Chocolate, most chocolate is produced through slavery in West Africa. So look for fair trade or slave-free chocolate. There's a great organization called the Food Empowerment Project. Check out their website. Bananas, they spray pesticides on people who live and work on those plantations. So if you buy organic bananas, it helps those people, not just your health, but it helps those people. And there's a lot of other workers' rights issues, noting that in the animal agriculture industry, you have some of the largest and worst human rights abuses, actually, and a disproportionate amount of slavery. And now here's another thing. When we talk about, we talk to vegans or people into these issues, is it vegan or bust? And really, incremental change is still good. So if somebody cuts down 10%, 50% of their animal product consumption, it still makes a big difference, okay? Of course, ideally, we'd like to cut it all out, but fine, making incremental change makes a difference to health and to the environment, okay? So make sure we understand that scientifically and not dogmatically, all right? Going beyond diet, okay? Remember that our houses, our cars, these massive homes that we have in so many places, our flights, our cars, and all the different things that we buy, you have to look at the life cycle process of each of these products and see the ecological impact. So diet alone is not going to change everything. It's one of the biggest factors, but we have to look at these other factors too, including things like population, sustainable development, and better treatment of people around the world. Okay, so it's good to be, I think, humble about these issues, to always keep learning, speak the truth, and think compassionately when we're talking about these issues. It's not an us versus them issue, okay? Remember, this is all of us together trying to make a change and learn about these issues and change the way that we together behave, okay? Individual change is good, but we need to work together to really make a difference here, all right? Social justice, sustainable development, we mentioned some of these things. And it also comes down to things like, women's rights, LGBTQ, human rights, the peace versus war industry. That's a huge thing. That's a huge ecological disaster and destabilizes humans' populations, causing, again, problems of inequality, population growth as well. So the idea of nonviolence amongst humans is of paramount importance. And overconsumption is a word that we should all know. When we talk about anything ecological, the problem is that we overconsume. So when you look at the life cycle of any product or any activity, we should look at how many what is the effect on net consumption? What is the impact if a lot of people participated in this activity? What would be the effect of net consumption on the environment, the materials, energy, and so forth, the things that we use? Okay. So compassion and ecology are always intertwined. These two people knew about it, right? These are, Einstein, he became a vegetarian for ethical reasons, and so did Gandhi, but little did they know, or maybe they did know, that there's a big ecological impact as well, all right? And since we're in the UK, it's nice to mention the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, where they talk about, some of the top scientists in the world talk about animal consciousness, human consciousness, and sentience, and the ethical implications, all right? So it's great for us, great for the planet to go more plant-based, to go vegan. And just concluding, plant-based diet is fundamental to sustainability, and it's on par with the entire materials economy and fossil fuel use on a global scale. Okay. It doesn't give us a free pass on other things. We still have to look at the other factors. And we cannot look at this issue in isolation of all the other issues that we mentioned as well, and overconsumption in general. Okay. And a little shout out to Greta, all right, and that's everything, all right. So I hope you guys found that useful. So thank you.